Howdy, howdy. If you're new here, I am building out a DIY expedition camper, and now it's time to really move to the inside and do something really cool and interesting. We got to cover all of these 80/20 framed out cabinetry with some beautiful Maslow CNC made wood panels. This is going to be really, really cool. This is a Makermade Maslow CNC that we made ourselves and put together, and then we're using it to cut wood and plastic panels for both the interior and the exterior cabinets of this camper. And it all started with, of course, a plan of looking at a whole lot of different materials for both the countertops and the wood cabinetry as well as the flooring. And I really wanted to use this paper stone for the cabinetry. It's just such a beautiful wood and so hard, but it's difficult to cut. And also it takes a lot of extra finishing. If something I want to stay away from, I really liked a lot of these different bamboos and even these zebra bamboos. Just really a palm product instead of a bamboo product. Very sustainable like bamboo and very hard. I like the looks of it a lot, but boy, it's very difficult to cut and has some really pretty nasty splinters. So I went ahead and switched over to bamboo. I just like it for its sustainability and the color of the grain with that carbonized one, like the one on the left there. So I like that darker tone. And there's a lot of different grains and stuff, and Plyboo was really excellent to work with. I went actually down and met with the guys at their offices, and we went through a bunch of different samples, and also I took some of the different countertop and flooring samples I was narrowing it down to and started to piece all these different colors together to really figure out what would work best from these samples I was collecting in my, call it, engineering studio, aka the kitchen table, dining room table. But took all these different pieces, and here it is. Now we're coming together with something that's really cool, and I love the edges, and let me show you how we made this, put it together, and ultimately what we got. So we received the package, we opened it up, and we followed the instructions, which are pretty good, and all the parts are well laid out and wrapped, and even the dog enjoyed undoing some of the wrapping there. But there was still some online information we had to pull up on different groups, online portals and Facebook groups and so forth, which have been immensely useful and helpful to not only help with the setup, but also, of course, the calibration and other features about operating the Maslow CNC machine. But nonetheless, we finally got it set up and then went ahead and tested it out. This is exciting. Oh, it needs power. Could turn on as you plug it in. Yep. And we went ahead and tested out on this white PVC expanded foam. Really easy thing to cut, and something else we had laying around that was some spare parts. However, we did learn a couple of things. One, we had to turn the power on, and after that, we did not also get the router bit as tight as it needed to be, and did lose the router bit in this first test here. But fortunately, nothing bad happened. You completely lost a bit. So after making these test cuts on this really easy to cut expanded foam PVC, which cut really nicely, and just doing some different test cuts, testing out some squares and circles, we went ahead and advanced a little bit of, thicker or heavier duty, high density polyethylene. And this shows you a little bit of just how the Makermade Maslow works by simply just pulling on each one of these chains, a little motor in each corner of that chain, and it just simply pulls on one or loosens the other and allows the Maslow to then very much just move along this vertical plane to where you need it. And we just set up the board in a way that enables us to basically fold it up against the wall, but even when it's out, it only takes up or sticks out from the wall about a foot. So it's very compact, and that was one of the big reasons of buying this. It doesn't take up a whole entire, basically 10 by 5 foot section of your shop space. And after we did those things and got it calibrated and everything was working right, and with our vacuum hose connected, and of course our power line with enough extension so that the whole sled can move all the way across the whole table, the cuts started turning out to be just fantastic. They were just perfect, as you can see here, not just making the cuts, but also even the holes for mounting and everything else exactly where they need to be. So take a look at these pieces here. It's pretty amazing what this thing could do. And that's one of the great things about it, is not only can it make these nice perfectly square cuts and put rounded corners and also drilled holes and everything else, there are also nice rounded cuts, as you can see in this piece here, and exactly where they need to be. And what I'm doing here is just some really finishing that still has to happen to be done, where I'm just countersinking those tools. We're just using 1/4 inch bit to just simply cut the pieces out, and then I'll come back in and do any routing on the edges to smooth them out or give them a rounded edge or also to, of course, do the countersinking, and occasionally also add a hole or two exactly where I need it to be, where I wasn't sure where it might need to be in the future. But you can see this piece here, it's really fantastic. It makes these nice curves and straight cuts and all really perfectly. We're getting down to millimeter-ish accuracy, maybe up to millimeter half of accuracy. Really excellent considering how this tool is. Now granted, it did take us a lot of time to get everything calibrated and set up, and we dealt with some initial issues early on, other than of course losing a bit and plugging in power, but also like our plywood, our bamboo plywood was quite bowed, and so it was sticking out from our wasteboard here, and so we had to then screw down these boards and learn how to do that. And once we did that, we could see here we're getting really good results with all these little holes here, circles, you know, all the different configurations that we've been cutting. And one of the things you can see here too is that we also set up a multi-power strip up above to go ahead and plug in the Maslow itself, and also the router and the vacuum, and those are each on separate circuits now. We've also went ahead and of course have a laptop that's associated with this to help run this, and by each having the vacuum and the router on separate circuits, we know that we're not going to take down a circuit like the Maslow while it's in the middle of a cut. Granted, it does pick up when it does fail in the middle of a cut, if power does, but we just want to make sure not have those issues. And you can see here, making a cut, it does move slowly. It's also quite loud cutting this bamboo plywood, but it does a great job. And even with these like shallow cuts in here, you can see, which are going to be recesses in there for some lighting that's going to be put in there, which is really just quite wonderful. And also these more complicated cuts, and all these little holes, and even the slots, and all these of course take time to make all these cuts, but it can make these really nice complicated cuts. Whereas of course if I was doing this with a table saw and just a bandsaw, it would take a long time, and then we get to really complicated cuts like this one here that really turn out pretty fabulously with all these different cuts and these holes and everything. You have to get aligned, and then the actual utilization of a full 4x8 sheet is actually quite excellent once laid out. Here it is. I'm super excited to get my first piece staying ready to go in. This is an outlet cover, or outlet, electrical outlet, AC outlet mounting point. I rounded out the inside edges on both sides just to make sure it kind of fits around the outlet cover, it can push in, and it's got just a nice rounded edge from any rubbing or anything that's going to happen with the wires. Mounting holes, really cool, already lined up. I rounded out this part here, which is a wire pass through, rounded out both sides of that, and also just rounded out these vents, just make it a nice little smoother, make sure I don't have any slivers or anything. Gave it a nice finish sand down. Basically the same thing on the other side, even though I don't really need rounding on the back side, but nonetheless, that's what it is. I'm going to go ahead and give it a first coat right now with lacquer. And I'm going to use a semi-gloss on the inside of cabinets. This is on the inside of cabinets, and the satin on the outside. Give it a little more light reflectivity on the inside of cabinets where you need it most. And I'm going to do a light initial coat here. I've already cleaned it down. And then I'm going to flip it over. And on the back side, I'm just going to do a really light single coat. I'm going to flip it back over, and as that dries, do a second coat on the exposed side. Just make sure it's well sealed. Get the edges as well. Again, just make sure it's well sealed. Keep any humidity and stuff like that changes from happening. And that's probably going to do it. So let's do it. And I chose to use this can lacquer, and one, because I don't have to do any prep and like get out a spray gun and an air hose and all that stuff, and also get masked up. I can just use this effectively without masking, and even putting on gloves or anything like that. I can do it really just outside or even in the garage. It does smell a bit inside the garage, but it's not terrible. But outside it's perfectly fine, and it's really quick and easy to use. It's pretty cheap and simple, although it is a lot more expensive than of course doing this in bulk. But the big benefit is I'm doing mixing, cleaning, and all this stuff, and because I'm doing a lot of little batches, this is really a much more convenient way to do it than if I were doing one really big batch. I'd probably go ahead and use a spray gun and a more bulk container for this. You can see a little bit of how rough these vented cutouts are with the Maslow CNC. It's simply just using a 1/4 inch plunge router bit, essentially just a cutout router bit made for CNC, and you can see those slots are very, very good, right? They're just a slight little wave to them in some cases, but generally they're very straight and everything, but you get this little bit of rough edging and everything, and also it's a little bit of a sharp edge. Now most of these won't matter because they're in places that don't matter a whole lot, but I want to clean them up. I want to make them look better. I want to make sure there's no slivers along here so that touching them isn't going to, you know, break off a sliver or chunk this out. And so I want to make sure nice and smooth, and ideally also rounded. That's also going to improve airflow. It's going to improve the laminar airflow. It's going to go through these vents. That's the whole purpose of them. And some, as you can see in here, even a little bit rougher where you got some little more strings and everything. One of the things I tried initially at first was to use a countersinking tool to basically go around and scrape out all the way around. But I found that it kind of dug in to these vents and actually sometimes overdug and splintered out a little bit. And I'll show you the result of that. Is this piece right here. It's beautiful, right? I've already sanded it down. I've countersunk the holes, ready for being mounted. And when I dug it in, a little hard to see probably on some of this video, but you can see it chunks it out in sections like right there, right down here as well. And so I chose this to be my backside. You can see in the corners here, again, chunking it out. I even tried to use the countersinking tool to round that out a little bit. I probably could have used a little bit of a hand sander, but I can't really get in there with any other sanding tool that I have. So what I did is I found, which was really hard to find, it would seem easy enough to find, is just simply a round over router bit and just put right down here, right? The challenge with this, these are only 1/4 inch slots. We cut these as 1/4 inch slots because that's what we have as a CNC bit. Changing out the CNC bit and the Maslow requires literally hours of recalibration, so it's just not worth it. So we just keep that same bit in there. And with the 1/4 inch bit, the CNC can just simply do its passes on the same line until it gets all the way cut through, right? Because it only cuts a partial depth at a time, instead of have to go cut a piece a little more until it gets the width. So that made it a lot nicer. It also gives for a pretty nice structural integrity of this piece here by having roughly these are inch center to center lines here with the 1/4 inch slot. But almost all the round over router bits I found, every single one except for really one brand, has a bearing that's a 3/8 inch bearing, so too big to fit into this 1/4 inch slot. So I was able to find an Amana bit, and I'll put a link in the show notes here, that has a tiny bearing. It's like an 1/8 inch bearing, I think is what it is. And I was able to get these in an 1/8 inch and a 3/16 and I think a 1/4 inch round over. So I bought a couple different sizes. And that bearing is so tiny, it's hard to put in perspective, but the nut that holds it on actually is slightly bigger than the bearing. So it actually, you can feel it just have a little more friction than a typical bearing would. But the big benefit of this is that now I can fit this right into that slot, follow this track around on both sides, and that'll not only give me a nice round over on the edges, but also into the corners here as well. So the result of this is this piece here, and you can see after I already did the countersinking tool, I came back over with that round over bit, set it just a little bit deeper, so I have a nice smooth edge, and it really refined it up. Makes it look so much better in both appearance and also its feel. And so that's what I'm going for. So let's go ahead and do that to these other pieces here. Now, one of the benefits of this bit as well is if I put that all the way in there, you can see it doesn't come through. So I can actually put it down on another piece here. Yes, it's risky, but I'm really out of limited workspace here. I'm working outdoors here because it's a pretty nice day, even though we're getting into the winter time. And so I can get out here and do some work, create the sawdust out here instead of in the shop. And also I'm finishing some pieces over here as well with the lacquer, so they're drying up right now, and then I'll flop them over, do the other side, and generally it's pretty very light wind with it slightly blown away from the pieces I'm drying up on the lacquer there. So I'm keeping my sawdust effectively away from that, hence why I'm not wearing really a mask, because I'm not really creating a lot, and even though I probably should, but this will help clean up these holes. So let's get to it. And rounding over the slots or any edges, along with also countersinking any holes and also sanding down the piece, are really the final steps that we've done before then cleaning them off and lacquering them. So it's relatively simple and easy after all the cuts have been made on the Maslow itself. Hard to probably see, but look how nice and smooth this one is. This one is not, right? Really nice and rounded. Yeah, I got a little bit of burning in the corners here. It's kind of hard to avoid. Some ways it just creates a nice little bit of relief, and it's hard to avoid in those corners because I'm moving pretty slow through this, and also because I have the depth set pretty deep. And we'll see how this plays out right here. It's going to create kind of a rounded profile because this is a very small gap between these two. This looks like it's 1 inch on center versus that other one I showed you I think is actually 2 inches. So let's give this a try here, keep it going. Now, one thing I did not do before I did this initial cut was actually even look at what my front side is. And the reality is I'm assuming it's this. Always put the sticker on the front side. So I'm going to flip this over to the other side. And I might still even round out the other side just to smooth it out. I might just sand it. We'll see. It would improve the laminar airflow, but we're not talking a lot of venting here for these few vents here anyways. And I highly recommend rounding over both the edges and or any slots here, because the bamboo can certainly have very sharp slivers. So you see, there's the look. Pretty thin little line here, right? Even though you flip it over, and it's actually fairly thick, right? That's a 1/4 inch thick. But on the face, it looks really thin. It kind of gives a nice, almost stained glass window appearance. And so I'm going to just go with that. This right here is a 3/16 versus an eighth inch, and I probably could have done an 1/8 inch just fine. It probably actually look a little better for this, but you know what? I'm just going to stick with it because I don't want to have to change the bit, and I think it's okay. It really feels nice once I sand that. It's going to feel great. And after rounding the edges and the slots and everything else, and of course countersinking the holes, went ahead and sanded it really all the way down to like about a 250 grit, and that seemed to work out really well for these panels, and also the look that we're looking for with the lacquer on top of it. You can see there's a couple little challenges. One is finding the power button on this DeWalt mini router, which I love this little trim router. It's great, particularly working out here. You can only see I can use one hand, I have to use two hands. And you can see I can even manage it by even like while it's running, move from hole to hole, because it's such a tiny little bearing, I can definitely get in there just fine. So there we go. Now I just think I'm going to do is sand this down. I don't think I'm going to mess with the back because this is not a removable panel. It's just a fixed panel. So I think that'll be great. Let's go on and do the other ones. I'll move on to sanding next. Let's get these others routed out. This one I am going to route both sides because this is a door, and this one I don't remember what this is, but you can see it's got those little slots there because that's where Maslow one automatically set its strength bits. So clearly that will be my back side. This will be my front side. I'm moving the tape so it doesn't get hung up on the router and cause a little bit of a jump on it. And I'll say, like, there is something really rewarding with routing out these slots because everyone is exactly the same dimension, because that's how good the Maslow is. It's so rewarding and easy to go and clean these out now. Well, I guess there goes the battery. Okay, new battery. What I found is that when you get the little vibration, it seems to have less if I put the base here, in the direction of travel. Now where's that switch? There it is. And if I just sanded down this panel nice and flat, it would probably be just fine. I wouldn't need to go ahead and route out every one of these little slots, but I just think they look nice this way. It does minimize or reduce any chance of them splintering off. And of course, the Maslow is not quite as perfect as a professional $25,000 CNC, but remember, this is a $1,000 CNC with basically a $15 or $20 CNC bit in there. And so it doesn't do a quite as precise job. And this bamboo does splinter a fair amount, and maybe that's because it was a little bit warped from storage. Whew. That's a lot of dust. A lot indeed. While it is a lot of work to go ahead and round out all these little slots, I tell you, these slots are really wonderful for not only ventilation, but also just an appearance on some of these panels, and of course most especially for the ventilation, which of course routing out these edges does help with that, and a little bit of airflow, plus just minimizes the splintering, and they look great. I can actually hear and feel all these little splinters coming off. These are what shaves right off. Those splinters is what eventually would break off rubbing this. So now it's as nice and smooth, and it's going to get really smooth once I sand it out. It's going to be fantastic. Quite a bit more sawdust being created than I expected. Okay, now my process is to sand the edges first, then route, and I'll show you the reason why. Because the Maslow has these little connector points here. Let's see if you can really show you that. And we've already cut these off because this is what separates it from the board and the piece that's being cut. You can see there's another one right there. Right, and as after we already cut it, but now I got to sand those flat, or else when I take a router over there, it's going to bump over that, right? So I got to sand that flat. You can see there's one, basically at least one in every edge, depending on some edges you even have two. And you can see this edge has also got a little bit messed up here. The Maslow sometimes does that on a specific corner of the board. So I'll flatten these out, just put a sander on the edges here, flatten them out on the edges, then give them the nice rounded edge that I want. I'm going to change out the bit to the other bit to do that. So I'm going to first sand these, change out the bit, come back with the router with the regular round over bit on there, That way I can get the edges all the way, get a nice round over profile on them, give them a nice smooth contour on the edges, particularly these doors and panels where they're going to get bumped up. You can see we already did this on this piece here. You can see that gives it a really nice smooth texture face. It's beautiful. This panel's not going to be handled at all, but it still just gives it a really nice feel. And that is a wonderful thing about not only wood, but also this wood, which has these beautiful deep grain in the bamboo. And of course, it also varies as the different layers go through, and you can see from the edge. And that's one nice thing about rounding over the edges, not just to smooth them out and give them that nice contoured texture, but also because you're actually looking into that grain on the end of the board. And that's really nice with the layers of the grains. It's really nice to do. So certainly when you do a Maslow wood cut, you certainly want to go ahead and, before you route any edges, sand out those little connector bits, that pieces that get stuck behind, and then go ahead and do your routed corners. And then after you do your routed edges, then go ahead and come back in and of course do a finish sand. And that's what I'm doing here. And you can see it's pretty easy. I'm not doing anything really complicated here. I'm just starting with a fairly coarse grit, and then just moving up. Maybe it's like an 80 or 100, and then moving up to about a 220 to 280, something like that, just where it's needed. Sometimes I only do that on the face and maybe keep a little bit more of a coarse grit on the edges, something in that like 150 to 250 range. And that seems to be plenty for this bamboo. You don't need to go really fine on it, and then just simply clean it off. And then that's where spraying the lacquer on it certainly gives it that really nice finish. And here I'll show you. And this lacquer I'm using, again, just from a spray can. Yeah, it's simple, it's cheap, it's readily available, and also I can respray it should these panels get scratched. I don't have to resend them back down. It just goes ahead and re-layers back on and thins itself back out. Effectively just kind of melts itself back into each other. Now, these panels turn out really great. I love the way they look. Of course, we could cut some really complicated cuts, like these circuit breaker panels, which are really complicated little cut to keep everything lined up, but they end up turning out and looking great and fitting right in there perfectly as expected. This switch panel is just on here as demonstration, but the nice rounded edges. And then you look at these other panels like this one, and see how it turns out afterwards when it's all done. It looks so great. And this would have been really complicated to do with the drill press, cut that big hole, and then of course trying to route out that internal section or jigsawing out. And then you look at all these other panels in here and just how good looking they are, and the drawers even that we're making. We're making these without dovetails, just really simple kind of butt joints. I'll go into that a little more in the future. And we already cutouts for all the latches and everything else. We're just getting ready to install that. And you can see we got some pretty complicated panels and just how they all go together and fit together. And that's, of course, part of the thinking and planning that has to go into this, is how is everything going to fit together and what's going to go in everywhere. And then you end up with all these stacks of these panels when they're cut and they're finished and ready to go in. And then we have to start installing them. And that's where, of course, having this numbering scheme is really also important, so we can make sure we all know where they're going. And then of course there's some leftover remnants, and some of it ends up being discarded, but we're also have started to cut some other panels for the bathroom, and also even the countertops, which I'll go to in a future video, and also some more with HDPE, which this is a version of that, and here's another version that how it turned out at the end. I think it looks so great. I'm so happy with this Maslow. Definitely recommend it for helping you with your camper build or any other projects. So certainly I recommend a CNC cutter for a camper build and or any other projects. It's been working out great, but it does take a lot of work to get all set up. We've used it though also for our countertops and some other panels, and there's also a lot more coming up in these next videos. So thanks for watching, subscribing, and look forward to sharing more with you.